Welcome to Reform Thinking. Have you ever stopped to think about how just one word, a simple word from an ancient language, could actually open up this huge window, a window into, well, God's own actions and even our own accountability as humans? It sounds like a big claim, maybe, for just a single word. But as we look into the scriptures, we find the language is often incredibly precise, purposeful. It carries, well, a lot more weight than you might think at first
Oh,
glance.
it really does. It's amazing sometimes. And today you've set us a task, haven't you? To really dig into the Hebrew word that's Paʔal, and the related terms that go with it. Our goal here really is to sift through all the linguistic details, the historical context, pull out the main insights, and show why this specific word gives us such a unique perspective, a perspective on God's active work, his doing, and just as vital, our own actions, our conduct. This isn't just, dusting off old words for fun. It's about understanding action, intention, consequence, all from a biblical viewpoint.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Pile. At its most basic level, you're saying it means simply to do or to make. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's the core meaning, to do, to make. And what's really interesting, as you mentioned, is that this root, this idea, it isn't just Hebrew. You find echoes of it all across the Semitic language family.
Ah, so it's widespread.
Very. Tells you it's an old fundamental concept, right? Deeply embedded. So like in Jewish Aramaic, it can mean laborer, someone who does work. In Ugaritic, which is related to Hebrew from ancient Syria,
Hmm.
you often see it as Beal or sometimes Peel in people's names, suggests action, agency right there in their identity.
Huh. In names, even.
Yeah. And Phoenician Punic inscriptions found all over the Mediterranean. They use this verb frequently too. Later Aramaic keeps it.
Yeah.
And its Arabic relative, fa'ala, also carries that basic do or make meaning. So you're right, it's not exclusively Hebrew, but,
There's always a but, isn't there?
well, yes, but it's the specific way it's used within biblical Hebrew. That's what makes it stand out. That's where the real story is.
Okay, so how does it stand out? Because, I mean, most of us probably think of another Hebrew verb for to do or to make, right? Yeah, that one seems much more common. So what's the difference? What's the surprise with Palau?
Right, that's the key question. Yeki is definitely your workhorse verb. Covers almost anything you can do or make, very broad. But pāl, it operates, you could say, on a higher level. The sources we looked at are quite clear. It's mainly used in elevated contexts, poetic contexts.
Elevated, like more formal or theological.
Exactly. Think Psalms, think Job, think prophecy. When the text wants to convey something with real weight, something significant, maybe even divine action,
Mm.
it often reaches for pāl. It's almost like a stylistic choice to signal importance. You called it a spotlight word earlier, and I
Yeah.
think that's a great image. It draws your attention, says, pay attention. This action matters.
A spotlight word. I like that. So you're saying you won't find Paul just hanging out in, like, the legal codes or straightforward historical accounts.
Pretty much, yeah. It's strikingly absent from narrative texts, from the legal material in the Old Testament. Its home territory is definitely Psalms, Job, the prophets. And that absence itself is telling, isn't it? It suggests the biblical authors were being deliberate, saving this word for moments needing a more maybe formal or artistic or even profound tone, like they were carefully curating their vocabulary for specific effects.
Curating vocabulary, that suggests a real intentionality.
It does, and this leads to some interesting scholarly ideas. P. Humbert, for example, he suggested that pāl might have actually come into Hebrew from outside, maybe Phoenician or other Canaanite languages.
An import.
Possibly. And he speculates, it's just speculation, mind you,
Yeah.
but he speculates that maybe its less frequent use compared to ḥāśāh might reflect a kind of concern for the, let's say, purity of what they considered classical Yahwism. Like
Yeah.
the scribes were carefully choosing words, maybe trying to keep a distinct Hebrew literary and theological voice.
Wow. That's fascinating, the idea that word choice itself could be part of defending theological purity. That's a level of linguistic self-awareness I hadn't really considered. Okay, and for those listening who love the nitty-gritty grammar, you mentioned it only appears in the qual stem. What does that tell us in simple terms?
Ah, good question. Yeah, qual only. Basically, the qual stem is the simplest, most basic active verb form in Hebrew. Think he did, he made. Direct action. So even though Paul's is used in these elevated poetic ways, its core meaning is still straightforward, direct, impactful. It doesn't get complicated with other grammatical forms that might add nuances of causation or reflection. It just acts. It states the action plainly.
Simple form, profound context. Okay, so we've got the basic meaning. It's sort of elevated style. Now, to really get a feel for poʻāл, we need to look at its history, right?
Yeah.
How it was used over time, because you said it's not just a late development. It has deep roots. What are some of those early examples, those ancient anchors?
That's right. It wasn't something invented during the exile. It goes back further. We find pāʿal in the pre-exilic period, before the Babylonian exile. Think the prophet Hosea. Like in Hosea 6.8, talking about the wicked deeds, the deceitful actions of Gilead, or 7.1, the iniquity in Samaria. Isaiah uses it too, early Isaiah. Chapter 31, verse 2 talks about God acting wisely against evildoers.
Okay, so in the prophets early on.
Yeah. And Psalms, which have some really old poetry, Psalm 28.3, Psalm 101.8, even Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 5, uses it for a startling, unexpected work of God that people wouldn't believe if told. So yeah, it's got pedigree. It was part of the sophisticated language of early prophecy and poetry.
And you mentioned Exodus 15.1. That sounds significant. Yahweh preparing an abode.
Yes, the Song of the Sea. That passage where Yahweh plants his people prepares a place for them. Many scholars date that poem, or at least parts of it, to the late pre-exilic period, maybe even earlier for some core elements. So it provides a pretty solid early anchor for pāʿal being used specifically for God's active preparation for his people.
Got it. And it's not just the verb itself, right? The related nouns also show up early.
Exactly. Take pāʿal, that can mean deed, work, or sometimes earnings. We see it way back in Samuel 23.2, Chronicles 11.22. They describe Benaiah, one of David's mighty warriors, as great in deeds. Rav Teralim, that's considered a very old use.
Benaiah, linking it right back to David's time.
All right. And other early uses of pāʿal include Deuteronomy 33.12n, blessing the work of Levi, Isaiah 5:1-12, where people ignore the work of Yahweh, Psalm 28.4, calling for repayment according to deeds, and the other main noun, pūlo, which often means work but leans more towards recompense or wage. Its oldest appearances seem to be Psalm 28.5 and Jeremiah 31.6. So the whole word family has ancient roots, even if its main flowering comes later.
Okay, that sets the stage really well. Strong historical foundation. But then, as you say, the dominant usage. That really seems to kick in during the exilic and post-exilic periods. Why do you think that is? Did something change?
That's where it gets really concentrated, yeah. The bulk of occurrences are there. It could be that the trauma of exile, the destruction of the temple, the need to rebuild, it prompted deeper theological reflection. People were grappling with God's actions, his judgment, his promises for the future. And pāʿal, with its weighty connotations, perhaps became a key word for expressing those profound thoughts.
Makes sense. So where do we see it most?
The numbers are pretty stark. Get this. 2/3 of all the times the verb paʻal appears, that's 57 times total, are in just 2 books.
2 books. Which ones?
Psalms, with 26 occurrences, and Job, with 12. And think about those books, right? Deep poetry, wrestling with God's ways, suffering, justice.
Exactly the kind of elevated reflective context you were talking about.
Precisely. It perfectly fits the profile. It's the language chosen when the weight of action, whether God's or human, is really under the microscope.
Okay, so Psalms and Job are the hot spots. Where else does it show up in this period?
You find it scattered through other poetic and prophetic texts from that era. Deutero-Isaiah, for instance, Isaiah 40-66, likely written during or after the exile, uses it 5 times. Often about God's new creative acts, his redemption of Israel.
Ah, like God doing something new for his people.
Exactly. Proverbs uses it 4 times, usually about moral actions and their consequences. And then you get isolated instances in prophets like Micah or Zephaniah, but the pattern holds. It stays within that realm of elevated, often metrical speech.
And the nouns follow suit. Paʻal and pāla.
They do. Pāʻal is almost always found in elevated speech or poetry, and pāʻal is consistently in metrical language, too. There are just a couple of really late exceptions where pāʻal pops up outside poetry, once in 2 Chronicles 15 in a narrative context about reform, and once in Leviticus 19, a legal text about paying wages promptly. But these are rare late outliers that kind of prove the rule. Its home is poetry and prophecy.
It's fascinating how a word can have such a distinct literary preference, almost like it has its own habitat. And briefly, you mentioned it continues into the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran literature.
Yeah, it does linger, less common than in the Old Testament itself, but it's there. The verb pāʻal shows up 4 times. The noun pūla a bit more often. Shows a continuity, The concepts it carried were still relevant centuries later for that community.
Any changes in meaning there?
Mostly continuity. There's one small interesting shift noted in one of the hymn scrolls, 1 QH 14.14. Instead of pairing the participle form, like workers of, with vor and iniquity, which is common in the OT, it pairs it with rajah, wickedness. It's subtle, maybe a slight nuanced shift in how they categorized evil actions, but it shows the language was still alive and developing.
Okay, interesting detail. So we've traced its path through history. Now let's pivot to the theology. What does Paul really tell us about God? You said when God is the subject, it often pictures him as making or preparing.
Exactly. Think back to Exodus 15.so.pn. God preparing, making, establishing a dwelling place. It's specific, purposeful action. Or Proverbs 16.4, which says, Yahweh has made everything for its purpose, Paʔal lamahu. It's not just passive existence. It's active, intentional creation and arrangement by God, his sovereign hand shaping things.
And it can be very personal too, right? You mentioned Job 36.3.
Yes, Elihu's speech. He refers to God as Pili, my maker, my creator. That really brings it home, doesn't it? Not some distant cosmic force, but the one who actively made me.
It does. Now, this is a critical point you raised in the outline. Paʔal isn't typically used for the initial creation of the world.
Right. This is vital. We need to be careful here. When the Old Testament talks about the absolute beginning, creation out of nothing, it usually prefers other verbs, like bara, to create, often implying ex nihilo, or yasad, to found, yah, to form, like a potter, kana, to acquire or create, or even the common luya. Paʔal generally points more towards God's ongoing creative activity, his providence, his work within the created order.
So it's more about his current active involvement, sustaining and guiding.
Yes, precisely. It emphasizes God's continuous active hand in the world now, maintaining, directing, intervening. It counters any idea of a God who just wound up the clock and walked away. Paul shows a God constantly, actively at work.
That's a really helpful distinction. Active, ongoing providence. And Paul also speaks powerfully about God's mighty acts, his interventions, especially salvation.
Oh, absolutely. Psalm 74.2 on is a classic example. God is called Paul, your show literally, worker of salvations in the midst of the earth. It implies he repeatedly acts to save. Psalm 68.29 talks about God demonstrating his mighty ability for his people. Job 33.29 even speaks of God doing, these things, specific acts of intervention 2 or even 3 times for a person to bring them back from the pit. These aren't just vague good deeds, they're powerful, decisive rescues.
And it also covers him carrying out his plans, his ordinances.
Yes, his sovereign will being put into action. Isaiah 26.1 says, O Lord, you will ordain peace for us, for you have indeed done all our works for us. It attributes accomplishment to God. Isaiah 43.33, Habakkuk 1.5, they speak of God doing things, carrying out his purposes, sometimes in ways that astound people. He not only decrees, he accomplishes.
And he affects individuals directly, too.
Definitely. It's not just large-scale history.
Yeah.
Job 22.17 quotes the wicked, asking, what can the Almighty do to us, acknowledging his potential direct impact. And Job 35.6 uses it when Elihu asks Job, if you sin, what do you accomplish? Paʔal against him. It shows God's actions, and our actions have direct interplay. He engages personally.
Okay, so intervention, salvation, carrying out his will. What about judgment and righteous rule?
Paʔal and its nouns are key there, too. Deuteronomy 32.4 says God's work, pāloto, is perfect. All his ways are justice. That links his action directly to his righteous character. Isaiah 5.12, Job 36.24, Psalms like 44.2, 64.9, Isaiah 7.13, 95.9. They all point to God's work, encompassing his providence, his deliverance, and his judgment. It paints this comprehensive picture of a God actively governing, ensuring justice ultimately prevails.
Now, this other derived noun, mipel, you said this one is really special.
Yes, mipel. It's striking because it's used only for Yahweh's works, exclusively, and always in the plural, mipelim or mipelot.
Exclusively for God.
Yeah. So when you see mipel, it's a direct signal. This is about God's specific, significant actions. Proverbs 8.22 uses it for wisdom being the first of God's works, right at the dawn of creation. But it goes way beyond that initial creation. Psalms 46.9 and 66.5 use mipelot for his mighty saving deeds in history. Think the Exodus, crossing the Red Sea, the Jordan crossing. And it even points forward to his future, eschatological acts of judgment and salvation.
So it covers the whole sweep. Creation, history, future.
The whole divine program. His creative acts, his saving interventions, his ultimate governance over everything. Mipel kind of sums up the totality of God's sovereign work.
That's powerful. A dedicated word just for God's grand actions.
And just one more quick, intriguing example. Job 37.12. Here, the clouds are the subject of Paʔal. They're described as carrying out, doing whatever God commands them. It's this amazing picture of even inanimate creation acting as agents of God's will, performing his purposes. shows the extent of his active control.
Okay, so we have this picture of God as the ultimate sovereign active doer. His Paʿal shapes reality. But what about us? When this word is applied to humans, how does it shed light on our actions, our accountability? You said it can just mean general making or doing.
Yes, sometimes it's neutral, just describing human activity, like Isaiah 44.15, a person makes an idol from wood, or verse 12, a blacksmith works palmetto. It's about the craft, the physical act. Or it can be general accomplishing, like in Isaiah 41.4, or Job 11.8, or even the negative sense of accomplishing harm, like the wicked person digging a pit in Psalm 7.16. In those cases, it's just describing the action itself without an immediate built-in moral judgment, just from the verb choice.
Well, here comes the other side of the coin, right? You highlighted that when Paʁal describes human moral conduct, it often leans negative, suggesting actions that are, well, crooked, perverse, not aligned with God.
It really does. It's quite striking how often it carries this negative moral weight when applied to us. Like, humans are described as committing deceit in Hosea 7.1, or doing injustice, Psalm 119.3 blesses those who do no injustice. Job 36.23 uses it when Elihu asks who can accuse God of doing injustice. Micah 2.1 talks about those who plot evil, and then when morning comes, they do it. Yiplo. Proverbs 6:20 has the adulteress wiping her mouth and saying, I have done little iniquity, no iniquity. It consistently seems to highlight actions that deviate from God's standard. It sets up a kind of spiritual tension.
And that leads to that specific phrase you mentioned, the one that really stands out, workers of iniquity.
Ah, yes, Play 1. It's almost a technical term, a formula. It appears 23 times, heavily concentrated in the songs. And it paints a very clear picture of who these people are.
What's the picture?
They're portrayed as active enemies of God and his righteous people. Their main tools are often words, lies, slander, planning harm secretly while speaking peaceably, like Psalm 28.3 describes. They often deny God's relevance or power, relying on themselves, on human schemes, rather than trusting God. Isaiah 31.2 contrasts them with God's wisdom. Hosea 6.8 calls Gilead a city of Palæ. Job 34.8 talks about keeping company with them. Their wicked words lead to wicked deeds. There's this connection between inner rebellion, deceitful speech, and harmful actions. They're defined by their practice of iniquity.
So a really strong negative association for human action described by Paʁal, but you did say there are rare positive instances. It's not always negative for humans.
Correct. It's important to note the exceptions, even if they are few. Psalm 15.2 describes the person who can dwell with God as one who walks blamelessly and does righteousness. And Zephaniah 2.3 urges the humble to seek righteousness and humility, implying they should do or carry out God's ordinances. So the word can describe righteous human acts that align with God's will.
But the fact that these are rare, what does that suggest?
Well, it could suggest a couple of things. Maybe the word itself, being so weighty, inherently tends to highlight human shortcomings more often. We fall short of the divine doing it often implies. Or perhaps it underscores just how significant and frankly uncommon it is when human actions truly align with God's perfect standard. It implicitly praises those rare moments of genuine righteousness.
That makes sense. It says something about the human condition, maybe. Now, beyond the moral sphere, you also mentioned it can relate to acquiring things, or just daily toil.
Yes. Proverbs 21.6 uses it for acquiring riches through lying. Notice the negative connection often creeps back in even here. And the noun pol can definitely refer to just daily work, labor. Psalm 104.23 paints a picture of man going out to his work and labor until evening. And Deuteronomy 33.11 uses it in a blessing on the tribe of Levi, asking God to accept the work of his hands, likely referring to their cultic duties, their service. So it covers the spectrum, from profound moral acts to everyday effort, all viewed as doings under God's eye.
Okay. This brings us neatly to the outcome, the consequences. The derived nouns seem crucial here. Let's start with pula again, deed, work, earnings.
Right. Pāʿal is quite versatile. It can mean the act of doing something, the execution. It can mean the result of that action, the deed, the work itself. And it can mean what you get from it, the earnings, the wages. So it bridges the action and its result or reward, cause and effect rolled into one.
And it carries that moral quality strongly, too.
Very much so. A pāʁal can be judged ethically. Proverbs 21:11 says even a child is known by his deeds, if they're pure and right. Zakwayar. Proverbs 21.8 contrasts the crooked way of the guilty with the upright work of the pure. But conversely, Isaiah 59.6 speaks of the wicked whose hands hold the work of violence. So the word itself demands you ask, what kind of work, righteous or wicked?
And critically, For Reformed thought, this links directly to divine justice, doesn't it? God requiting according to our pāʿal.
Absolutely central. This isn't just an interesting linguistic point. It's core theology. Scripture repeatedly states that Yahweh repays people according to their pāʿal. Jeremiah 25.14. I will repay them according to their deeds. Psalm 28.4. Repay them according to their deeds and the evil of their practices. Job 34.11. For according to the work of a man, he will repay him. This underscores God's righteous judgment. Actions have consequences. There is a direct, divinely overseen link between what we do and what we receive.
A fundamental principle of accountability. And you also mentioned pāʿal can just mean literal wages.
Yes, the tangible return for labor. Jeremiah 22.13 condemns the one who built his house unrighteously and uses his neighbor's service without wages, shows the injustice of withholding pay. Job 7.2 talks about the laborer longing for his wages at the end of a hard day. So it connects our work not just to spiritual accountability, but also to the material fairness of compensation.
Okay, so that's pāʔal. Now, the other noun, pia, you said this one also means work, but leans more heavily towards recompense.
That seems to be its primary nuance, yes. While it can refer to the work or deed itself, like in Jeremiah 31.16, where God promises Rachel that her work, Pila, will be rewarded. Or 2 Chronicles 15.7, encouraging Asa that there is a reward for Judah's work, Pila. Psalm 17.4 speaks of avoiding the deeds of violent men. Its main force often seems to be the outcome, the wage, the gain, the reward, or even the punishment that results from the work.
So it really emphasizes the consequence part of the equation.
I think so. It makes that cause and effect relationship very explicit. Think of Leviticus 19.13. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until the morning. Direct link between work done and payment due. Ezekiel 29.20 talks about God giving Nebuchadnezzar Egypt as his wage, Pila, for the labor he performed against Tyre. Proverbs 10.16 says the wage of the righteous leads to life. Proverbs 11.p contrasts deceptive wages with the true reward of sowing righteousness. Psalm 109.20 even asks for punishment to be the wage of the wicked from the Lord. It consistently drives home that actions produce results, for good or ill.
And you mentioned a beautiful figurative use, God's wage.
Yes, isn't that striking? Isaiah 40.10 and 62.11, they picture God coming in power, and his reward or wage is with him. And what is that reward? Is redeemed people, the returning exiles. It portrays his people as the precious outcome, the payoff, you might say, of his mighty redemptive work, the fruit of his labor. It's a wonderfully intimate picture of God valuing his rescued people.
That is powerful. His people as his reward. Okay, so drawing all these threads together, this deep dive into Paʿal and its family, what are the main takeaways? What does this potent, if less common, word really teach us about God and ourselves?
Well, first, I think Paul gives us this incredibly vivid picture of God's active engagement. He's not distant, not passive. He's righteous, purposeful, actively working in history and individual lives and the whole cosmos. It reveals a God who accomplishes his will, who intervenes decisively, not just a creator who set things up, but one who is continually doing. It stresses his active sovereignty.
An active, sovereign God. Got it. And for us?
For us humans, Paul really throws the spotlight on the moral weight of our actions. It reminds us that what we do isn't neutral. Our behavior isn't trivial. It has spiritual significance. It pushes us toward either righteous conduct aligned with God or, as it so often describes, perverse actions that oppose him. It underscores our answerability. Our deeds matter eternally.
Accountable for actions that have real weight. And the nouns reinforce that.
Absolutely. Paul, and especially Paula, drive home the principle that actions have built-in consequences. Whether you frame it as wages, reward, or divine retribution, there's an outcome tied to the deed. This reflects God's perfect justice. He sees, he knows, and he ensures that actions receive their due recompense according to his righteous standard. Nothing is lost. Everything is accounted for.
So wrapping up, Paul, maybe not the most frequent verb for doing, but it packs a punch.
It really does. It holds this unique, valued place. It seems specifically chosen for contexts where the action needs to convey deep moral and theological resonance. It illuminates purposeful activity, God's sovereign purposes, our responsible choices, and shows how that activity leads to significant, often eternal outcomes.
Yeah.
It adds a whole layer of depth to just doing.
So a final thought for you listening. Maybe consider, as you go through your day, how this idea of pāʔal might challenge you to think not just about what you do, but how your actions, maybe even the intentions behind them, align with the active, purposeful will of your maker, the great Paʔal. What does this ancient word reveal about the God who is always acting, always working his purposes out? And what does it reveal about our responsibility as his creatures to act in response to him, knowing every deed carries weight?
That's a good challenge, reflecting on our own daily Paʔal through the lens of God's Paʔal and his ultimate Paʔal.
Indeed. Food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the language of Scripture here on Reformed Thinking.